Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back. Ira Boudway is with us. He's a writer for Bloomberg Business Week, and he covers the business of sport. And in today's Spotlight on Magazines, we're talking about a recent piece that he wrote about emerging technologies designed to detect concussions and CTE and what that all means for the NFL. Thanks so much for being with us, Ira.
Thank you for having me on.
So how are concussions currently detected in football?
Concussions are a subjective diagnosis, which means that you have clinicians who are trained to spot the symptoms. And there's a checklist. There are sort of standard ones that are used that have, say, 26 questions or 40 questions that they will ask you, if you're oriented to who you are, what day it is. And they will also look for certain neurological symptoms like, can you track with your eyes and things like that. Because there is no biomarker, there's no objective way, there's nothing in the body that we can use to see this person has a concussion, this person doesn't. It's a symptomatic diagnosis. And they're pretty good at it, but it's problematic because sometimes you don't see the event. I think when we think about it in a sports context, you see the hit, you kind of know that guy got hit in the head, but you talk to emergency room doctors, people come in and they have symptoms that look like maybe a concussion, but they don't remember what happened, or they're not reliable in giving their account of what happened, and maybe they hit their head, maybe they didn't, and it's sometimes hard to distinguish between head trauma and other kinds of neurodegenerative problems. So clinicians, both for sports and outside of it, are really hungry for an objective test for the condition for head trauma.
Yeah, and the repeated head trauma, the repeated concussions can lead to a progressive degenerative brain disease known as CTE. Tell us about that.
So that's a disease that happens over time. We're just really learning about it. It was first diagnosed in a football player, in Mike Webster, back in 2002, and it's only diagnosed after death because you have to autopsy. Basically, they take slivers of the brain and look for the signs of the disease. And it's a disease that looks a lot like Alzheimer's in terms of the symptoms. There's dementia, it's progressive, it gets worse over time. It's there a long time before it shows up. So eventually it can lead to suicides. It's happened with NFL players. So it's a really terrible disease that is correlated with with repetitive head trauma. And it doesn't have to be concussions. It can be these so-called subconcussive blows that are pretty common to the experience of an NFL player or any football player at any level. If you're in helmet and you're hitting your head against the turf, against the shoulder pads of somebody else, those are subconcussive blows that may be beginning to cause the damage that eventually leads to CTE.
And in your piece, you actually write, the disease, meaning CTE, has changed the conversation about head trauma in football. While concussions are often visible, the hit, the woozy trip off the field, and usually the return, CTE is insidious, the slow, inevitable collapse of the brain from within. There's currently no way to test for CTE in the living. By the time there are noticeable symptoms, the disease is far along. As a result, early detection of CTE has become a grail for scientists in the field. A diagnostic test would make it possible to distinguish this disease from Alzheimer's, to know how widespread it is, to begin to figure out why some people get it and others don't, and potentially to develop treatments for CTE. Now, there are several companies, as your story makes clear, looking for a way to diagnose this. What are they, and how do those companies differ?
The main one that I focused on is a company called Quanterix, and they have a way to test blood for proteins usually or other biomarkers in really small quantities to detect things like head trauma. They also use it for cancer research, for Alzheimer's research. It has a wide variety of uses, but in the case of CTE, you're looking for a particular protein, essentially tau, which is part of the makeup of our brains. It sort of helps it's on the passageways that neurons take, as our brain cells are sending messages to one another. And when you have CTE, it deteriorates and it kind of falls off of the pathway that it sits on, and that chokes the brain in essence. Makes it hard for the neurons to get across the pathways. And so what they are looking for is that tau getting into blood, and then seeing if they can locate it in the blood. The problem is that we have a blood-brain barrier, and this is a useful thing because it keeps infections out of our brains, but it's also why it's really hard to do tests for neurological conditions, for brain problems. It's really hard to know what's going on inside the brain. The brain is way behind a lot of our other organs in terms of science's ability to get in there and really understand the process. And so what these tests can do is find that little bit of tau, in this case, that gets across the blood-brain barrier, either because it's when you take a hit, it's jarred across the barrier, or it just sort of over time, some of it seeps across. And it's in tiny, tiny amounts that in the past we haven't been able to find with the sort of standard ways that you test blood. And they've developed a blood test that is much, much more sensitive, thousands of times more sensitive than the traditional method, and that has allowed them to start to see correlations between people who have concussions or who have suffered head trauma and increased levels of this tau in the blood. For concussions, they're already pretty far along toward the idea of a finger prick blood test that could say this person likely has a concussion. For CTE, it's a little tricky because this is not something where you saw the hit and you test hours later or a day later. This is, like we said, a condition that is stable in the brain and deteriorating inside the brain. And it's unclear kind of how much is getting across the blood-brain barrier, what to look for, and whether we can find it in the blood. But that's the Quanterix approach. There are also there's a company called TauMark that has a isotope, basically a drug called FDDNP, that you put it in your blood and you do a PET scan, and it's radioactive, and so it shows up in these scans in certain patterns if it attaches to these tau-related proteins. And that method is shown some promise as well, where the scans of these people who are suspected to have CTE look like the autopsies of people who, after death, were diagnosed with CTE. And what they want to do at that company is actually start to test people who have terminal illness, who they think have CTE, test them while they're alive. After they die, autopsy them and compare those two results. Because if you could with that method, they think, get to an FDA-approved test for CTE in living people. There's another company called Athlon Medical. I think I'm getting that right. They're in San Diego. They look at exosomes, and I should preface all of this by saying I'm a journalist, not a scientist, so I did my best to learn about each of these methods, but I can only get so deep with it. But the exosome is basically a piece of a cell that's sort of shed from it, but what's great about exosomes is that they tell you where they came from. So if you find tau in the blood, you can guess that it came from the brain, but you're not certain. Whereas if you find an exosome, it has information in it about what the source cell was. It could say this was a brain cell. And there's a tau-related exosome that they've isolated, and they're starting to do the same thing, where they find former NFL players and they test them and they say they have elevated levels of this exosome compared to a general population, and they're looking to expand those kinds of tests. The leading expert in this, I would say, is Bob Stern, who's a neurologist at Boston University, where they have this CTE center, and they are embarked on a 7-year study to try to figure out if they can diagnose CTE in living people. And he is basically using all of these things to see if maybe there's a battery of tests that if you put them together, you start with maybe a blood screen, it shows elevated levels of tau, you move on to a brain scan, do a PET scan, and maybe you can figure out a way to find the disease in the living. So maybe one of these companies will have the answer, or maybe it will be a combination of a bunch of them, or even a method that we don't know about yet.
Ira Boudway is our guest this morning. It's our Spotlight on Magazines. We're talking about a recent piece he wrote about the professional sports, particularly the NFL, and concussion technology. We want to hear from you. And we're splitting the phone lines up today by region. So if you live in the Eastern or Central time zones, call 202-748-8000. And if you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, call 202-748-8001. So Ira, let's take this away from the realm of science for a bit and move to the realm of professional sports. Has the NFL been supportive of this new technology to quickly diagnose CTE, and how disastrous some of these concussions might be on the field?
They have of late. In the case of Quanterix, and part of the reason that I chose to write about the company is that the NFL has awarded a pair of grants through a program they do with GE to Quanterix, totaling $800,000. They hold these contests for companies where they sort of submit to show how they are advancing head health and player safety, and the league looks at them and awards them one grant, and then they narrow it down to finalists, award them another grant. So Quanterix has got $800,000 from the NFL this way, and they have also, the league has talked publicly about the possibility of a concussion blood test and what a breakthrough that would be. I think the league is unequivocally excited about the idea of a concussion blood test just because it would solve a lot of controversy. I mean, now you have the concussion protocol, which becomes a thing that people argue about on talk radio and so forth. Is a player ready or not? This would basically eliminate a lot of that question. It would say this player's biomarkers show that they are not safe to play, or they are. And so they are excited about that idea. I think the question of CTE is a lot trickier for the NFL. If you go back to the history of it, starting with Mike Webster, if you've seen the movie Concussion or read League of Denial, which it's based on, which is a good book to understand sort of checkered history of the NFL when it comes to head trauma. There was a period there of at least 5 years where the leagues seemed to be trying to muddy the waters, to question the emerging science, to deny the problem. And they seem to have changed of late, but there are still people who are suspicious of their motives because it's possible that CTE really will be something that changes the NFL. If we do find out that it's in half the players, what does that mean for the league? What does that mean for the talent pool, for kids who are playing it at high school age and younger? What is the future of the NFL if we discover that it is directly linked to a fatal and a pretty terrible neurological disease?
We have Lou on the line calling in from Highland Park, Illinois. Good morning, Lou. What's on your mind?
Good morning. My basic question is, why does everyone in America have to pay high premiums for health care to people who take on extremely high-risk behaviors? And that is my basic question.
Well, I think in the case of the NFL, their health insurance, comes through the NFL, and the league has gotten better in terms of providing not just to current players but to former players, through negotiated deals with the union, health insurance to cover these kinds of conditions. The NFL is an extreme case. We talk a lot about head trauma with NFL players, but there aren't that many of them. I think the bigger question is when you talk about, you've got a whole bunch of military personnel who suffer repeated head trauma. You've got people, just in the world who've taken blows from an accident or something else, and who maybe, it's hard to detect what's going on with them. So I think that, the research into this will have benefits outside of the NFL, and the expense that's being spent now to learn about the disease and advance the science around it will rebound to the benefit of not just NFL players. We tend to talk about it there because it's very public and everybody knows the NFL, but it's a problem that stretches across much broader population.
Sandra's on the line calling in from Attleboro, Massachusetts. Good morning, Sandra.
Good morning. I've always had a question. I have 3 grandchildren, and 2 are dead right now. And the third one had repeated outbursts and everything else all different times of his life after he played Pop Warner football. They constantly were clanking heads, running down the fields, all of them, and they're all brothers. 2 are dead. And people stress, go ahead, bang your head, do this, do that. I seen my grandson in high school, the one that's still alive. The coach had to keep him out because he said he had a concussion. I heard him say it. And my grandson afterward was sent right out after he thought the thing was delayed, whatever, on the high school field. He's still alive. The other 2 are gone. And they're all brothers. Do something about it, please. Do something. This is awful. Thank you. Bye.
Well, I should start. I'm sorry for your loss, and I think that when you talk about concussions in football, really where it is most urgent right now is with children. There's a lot of question about whether kids should be doing this at all, whether they should be putting on helmets, whether they should be playing full contact football, and how soon, how early do you allow it? When do you put on pads? And I think the attitudes toward that have shifted considerably just in the last 5 to 10 years as the CTE has become something that a lot of people have heard of. I think that there are good reasons to hold back. Everybody I spoke with, different neurologists, neurosurgeons, researchers, I would usually ask them if they have kids and would you let your kids play football? And a lot of them said, they still would because we don't know everything about the disease yet, and the world is a fundamentally unsafe place. You can get a concussion riding a bicycle. And they didn't want their kids to not have the opportunity to play a sport that they loved. I think there's an idea that a lot of people who research around concussions and CTE hate football and want it to end. And that's not what I encountered. There was a lot of people who love sport. They love what it brings. They love the learning, the toughness, the discipline and the camaraderie that you get through a sport like football. And they wanted their children to be able to play it. So they were ambivalent, essentially, about letting children play the sport. I think, one of the things that does have to get better is detection. That, incidents like the caller spoke about where somebody gets a concussion and is back on the field because they want to or because nobody noticed, that's really dangerous. And any organization, I think, as a parent, grandparent, you want to be asking them, what are the protocols? Who's on the sideline watching? How are they trained? And to make sure that these decisions are not being made by coaches and parents, but by trained clinicians. I think that's the baseline for letting kids participate. And then I think we'll see, as we do learn more about the disease, I think, it will change both the way these decisions are made and how parents feel about it. I think that's one of the problems that the league is very focused on, that over time, if parents basically decide that this sport is too dangerous for my kid, then you don't have a pipeline of players coming into the NFL, or you have a pipeline that is narrowed to a specific group of parents and not others. And so they are trying very hard to reach out to parents and to have initiatives that teach safe tackling and things like that. But it's still a question of whether, even if you do it right, if you have heads-up tackling, as they called it, is there any safe way to play this game when you're 12? I don't think that's a question anybody can answer definitively right now.
We invite you to weigh in on all of this. If you live in the Eastern or Central time zones, call 202-748-8000. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, call 202-748-8001. Ira, we have a tweet here with the question, is any of this new technology being applied to other contact sports like hockey? I know from reading your article that it is.
Yeah, I don't know in specific what's being done, but certainly the companies that are advancing this science are wanted to apply it broadly. And a lot of the science has been looking at, for instance, there's a researcher, Jessica Gill, who's at the NIH Nursing Research Center down in Maryland. And she looked at across sports, University of Rochester college athletes, found 46 who had been concussed and studied their blood looking for this tau with this Quanterix technology, and found basically that your tau levels in your blood 6 hours after the head trauma, after the impact, predicted whether you'd be able to get back on the field within 10 days or not. And that was for a lot of sports. One of the researchers who's been using Quanterix for the longest to look for tau in blood, he started with boxers. He's a researcher in Sweden named Henrik Zetterberg. He started with boxers and then moved on to hockey players. There are studies that are looking at military personnel. So they're definitely thinking broadly about how to use this technology. I don't know, for instance, how the NHL is approaching it and whether they are welcoming the science in the way that the NFL seems to be now. I haven't spent time reporting on that. But there definitely is a question for a lot of sports. Hockey, soccer with headers and head impact there, mixed martial arts. And we've already seen, in a way, what's happening now with football happened decades ago with boxing, where they discovered a disease, a neurodegenerative disease, and realized that this, getting hit in the head over and over again was really damaging these players long after the bouts and when they were older.
Rod's calling in from Oakland, California. Good morning, Rod. What's on your mind?
Good morning. Hey, is there, sort of following on that last question, has there been any research done or connection made to the difference between the subconcussive blows and the concussive blows. So, like for sports like soccer, where there's generally no head trauma for a long duration, and then there's sort of, one sharp impact versus, the experience of an offensive lineman in football, where they have, 40 or 50 or 60 subconcussive blows during a practice even. Has there been anything done to sort of connect those or differentiate between those two experiences as far as CTE is concerned?
Most of the research that I'm aware of has focused on concussions just because it's easier to identify someone's had a concussion, let's study them, find the populations. When you talk about CTE, there really is a lack of research into populations, and that's precisely because we don't know who has it. So most of the work happens in autopsies. There are about 90 former NFL players who have been diagnosed with the disease, but even that is not the best data because it's only the players who pretty clearly had the disease by the symptoms at the end of their life who are getting autopsied most of the time. So it's a selected group of people. It doesn't tell us how widespread the disease is among NFL players, and we don't know why. Why some people get the disease and others don't, because it seems clear that to wind up with CTE, you need repeated head trauma, whether that's subconcussive blows or concussions. It needs to be repeated over an extended period of time. But there are people who have that happen and don't get CTE. And that's an unknown, why that happens. I think there's a lot of research to be done about, okay, what's the difference between, maybe it is about the intervals between hits, that you get CTE if it's constant low-level blows and there's no time to recuperate, whereas maybe you don't get CTE if you have a spectacular concussion blow once or twice with a wide space in between. I don't know. Nobody knows. They're starting to try to figure out if maybe it has to do with genes or nutrition, but all of this depends on being able to find the disease in living people and to diagnose it with confidence and reliably, and then they can start to say, these people got it, these people didn't. What are the differences between them? And maybe how can we make the people who are getting the disease function like the people who aren't, whether that's with a drug or some kind of other treatment or prevention. So the short answer is I don't know of any research that's specifically on that question, but definitely there's a lot of attention being paid to sort of what is the impact over time, how many impacts, and how that relates to the damage that we're able to find in people.
And now we have Gerard calling in from Lake Mills, Wisconsin. Good morning, Gerard.
Morning. Thanks for having me on. I'm actually piggybacking right off of the last commenter, because I remember I stopped watching NFL a lot about 2 to 3 years ago when all the furor was coming on about concussions. And one of the things they were always talking about was the possibility of many concussions having the same impact. Tying into that, has the protocol changed? Has the research changed on determining the recovery time after a concussion and how soon somebody should be going out?
That I don't think has changed dramatically in recent years. What has changed, I think, is the application. The league has gotten more rigorous about having people on the sidelines who can make those decisions with some independence. The basic battery of questions that you ask and neurological symptoms that you look for has been pretty well set. I think they continue to refine it, but that really hasn't changed. It's been more about making sure that everyone has the right motives, is most concerned about player safety, because you do have a situation where players want to get back on the field. There's a huge amount of incentive in the NFL in particular, but really throughout the sport. You want to show that you're tough, you want to contribute, you want to please your coaches. In the case of an NFL player, you want to maintain your livelihood, and so maybe when they ask you about a particular symptom, you don't report it, and you try to get back out there. And I think that is where the league is focusing its energies, is on making sure that they're getting good assessments done by people who are worried about player safety and not about wins and careers. That is, I think the tip of the spear for the league, because I don't think there's been a huge amount of change in the what we know about concussions from the outside, by looking at symptoms and by having smart clinicians there to do these examinations. That they're pretty good at it now. They're pretty good at spotting concussions, especially, like I said, if they know that there's been a head impact.
And the last call for this segment comes from Michael, calling in from Miami, Florida. Good morning, Michael.
It's great to be here. In regards to this discussion, I would like to contribute my own personal experience that I would say occurred to me about 15 years ago. I was 16 or 17 years old, and I was the lead quarterback for Ronald W. Reagan High School. But then it was the middle of the third quarter, and I managed to suffer a concussion somehow. It's hard for me to remember all the details. But I was suffering a concussion.
And I believe we lost Michael there. The question I had for you, Ira, was whether or not there's a federal role here. We've seen Roger Goodell testify before Congress. Congress has inserted itself in issues regarding professional sports. What's the role of Congress, if there is one, to cover CTE and issues regarding concussions?
Well, I think there's the funding question. The NIH is a big part of the research that's happening now, and the NFL has contributed to it $30 million in the past toward this kind of research. There's also a question of sort of forcing the NFL to do a better job. The league enjoys certain privileges in the way that it negotiates contracts, and it enjoys a kind of antitrust status. Is allowed to operate a quasi-monopoly in certain instances that is exemptions that are provided in federal law. And so that is why you will see and have seen league executives dragged in front of Congress for hearings, because they have to answer to us and to the federal government around those things. And that's always the threat that is held, that if you don't pay attention to player safety and health, if you try to cover up the problem of CTE and concussions, maybe we'll take away those privileges. So there's that role. That's kind of a nuclear option, but that is why the league answers to the public around these things, and I think that pressure has been really useful. It's been part of what has raised awareness, and I think Congress knows that it has the opportunity to grill people under oath and get answers on the record and have everyone see it and see whether the league is being forthright or not. I mean, it was a pretty big moment March of last year when Jeff Miller, who is the executive at the NFL, who's ahead of player safety, he was asked about the connection between neurological disease, between CTE and football. And in the past, for years and years and years, the league's answer was always, the science isn't out yet. Ask a scientist. We don't know. They wouldn't answer it directly. And he said there's obviously and clearly a link. They still rightly say that we don't know a lot, and there's a lot of questions yet to be answered, but they're at least now acknowledging the problem. And I think that is a result of pressure that has come from media and from the government.
Ira Boudway is a writer for Bloomberg Business Week. He was here for our weekly spotlight on magazines. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Coming up, more of your phone calls on our question of the day. Was Thursday night's U.S. missile strike on Syria in the national interest? Start calling in now. You see the numbers there right on your screen. Republicans, 202-748-8001. The line for Democrats, 202-748-8000. And independents, call 202-748-8002. And also you can hit us up on Twitter at C-SPAN-WJ. Give us a call. We'll be right back.
Next week in prime time on C-SPAN, Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern, from the National Review Idea.